This is the fifth video on teachers and teaching. Now, the history of Catholic schools and teachers is different from the rest of the public school system. Catholic teachers were usually educated outside of the normal schools for much of the time. Now, Catholic religious women, or nuns, Catholic women religious, as they say, played an important role in education in Canada. Indeed, in some areas, the school system may not have survived without them. Between 1639 and 1939, communities of religious operated about 3,100 educational institutions in Canada. These institutions ranged from infant schools to degree-granting universities. 76% of these, or just over 2,000 of them, were run by women religious. With the significant contribution these women made to education in Canada, I think we need to consider how they were prepared for teaching in the elementary and secondary schools. It's important to remember that teaching sisters are members of both a religious order and an occupational class. Their lives represent both a vocation and employment. They were governed by both religious and secular regulation. Now, by 1881, education had become one of the religious community's major activities. As a result, the Constitution and Rules of the Congregation of the Sisters of St. Joseph, for example, in the Archdiocese of Toronto in 1881, includes considerable detail about the regulations for these teachers, the directions for the operation of the convent academy, and instructions on the further education of teaching sisters. The emphasis given to teacher selection and education in the Constitution of 1881 demonstrates that the congregation was moving towards the formalization of instruction in its schools and academies. Now, in the 19th century, most communities of women religious were internally stratified. So in the community itself, there was a hierarchy. It was just 2 or 3 classes of members. Within the communities of women who taught, the classifications were generally choir sisters and lay sisters. The 2 classes were bound by the same vows, but differed in their responsibilities and in their rights. The choir sisters held the power in the order, and they were the ones to be employed in teaching or charity work. The lay sisters, L-A-Y, lay sisters, did not have the right to vote for the election of the Mother Superior or her counselors, nor could they rise to the position of Mother Superior. Their role was to manage the daily operations of the mother house, so things like cooking and cleaning, so that the choir sisters would be free to undertake the mission of the order. Now, the order recognized that teaching was a special mission that required care in the selection of new members who would become teachers. And so the teaching sisters were supposed to model religion and science, as the Constitution of 1881 phrased it, implying that there was both a moral and a secular purpose to their calling as a teacher. The directress of the academy assigned sisters to their teaching positions and prescribed their extra studies. Although there was every effort made to ensure there was a good fit between the sister and her position, there was almost a contradictory mix of encouraging intellectual curiosity while maintaining a pious humility. Achievement in the students, for example, was to be rewarded and celebrated, but the sisters were also supposed to teach students humility and love of God. So for both the sisters and the students, all glory resulting from any kind of talent was supposed to be a gift from God. Now, professional growth was important to the teaching sisters. The Constitution of 1881 explicitly directed the sisters to take part in conferences on the methods of teaching and so on. So they thought professional development of the teachers was important. And the records of the Sisters of St. Joseph record a wide range of professional development activities for sisters, like including guest speakers and seminars on topics ranging from astronomy to comparative education and training institutes and so on, mathematics, music theory, penmanship, and fine arts. Some sisters were also sent away on courses for advanced training. So even though the sisters made their own efforts at advancing the teaching, sisters' knowledge and skills and methodology, they also, though, had to deal with the changing Ontario government regulations that was occurring that we just described. And so teaching certification was one factor in this. For teaching sisters, certification raised questions about control between the secular and the religious authorities, between the federal and provincial jurisdictions, and similar contradictions. So for many members of the religious orders, it was felt that the 1867 Confederation of Canada Agreement allowed members of religious orders to teach without Ontario certificates. But by the 1870s, the separate school inspectors started to feel that it was unfair to the separate school children to allow teachers from the religious orders to not be certified teachers. And so there was a move to have a policy of teaching certificates for all teachers. And by 1905, any postulant, so any Catholic woman who wanted to be a nun and be a teaching sister, were advised to get some level of state certification before they entered the convent. So you were supposed to be trained before you even became the nun. And potential teaching sisters had to meet the two standards, both the standards of the order, the Sisters of the St. Joseph, and the state certification rules. And so teaching sisters really do represent a unique group of women teachers, because these women dedicated their lives to the service of God and neighbor through a lifelong career in education. Unlike other women, teaching wasn't just about gaining economic independence or social advancement. Neither was it a temporary position prior to becoming a wife and mother. Teaching truly was their vocation. And the life of a teaching sister was an interesting one because it wasn't solitary. Many teachers in the regular communities lived quite solitary lives because they had to quit teaching when they got married. For teaching sisters, they were living a life in a community with other women who shared a common vision and shared a common set of values. And so beginning teachers had a community to draw on to draw on the wealth of experience of these teachers, and they had structured opportunities to gain increased knowledge. Another question that's important is around the question of professionalism in teaching. Many of the efforts to certify teachers and to control what they did outside of the classroom and outside of the normal schools was about this effort to prepare teachers to be professionals and to make sure that teaching became a well-respected profession. Now, today, professionalism is explicitly important. Even in our university's academic calendar, the following comment is made under the title Professional Unsuitability. Quote, students in programs leading to professional certification must demonstrate behavior appropriate to practice in those professions, end quote. Teaching, of course, is not the only professional program in our university. Engineering would count under that category as well. But it's an important point to make that even though we might giggle at some of the rules that 19th century teachers had to face, we still have a sense that teachers are role models in society and have to stand up and be somehow good moral role models. And indeed, the Ontario College of Teachers, which came out of Bill 31 in 1996, plays that role in many ways. The legislation authorized the creation of this Ontario College of Teachers as a self-regulatory professional agency for certified elementary and secondary school teachers. The legislation specified, things like who should be in the college, how it should be governed, what the leadership should be, what jurisdiction the College of Teachers should have over things like professional concerns, including accreditation of teacher education programs, teacher certification, professional standards, and discipline, among other things. Now, some of these matters, professional matters, had previously been managed by the Ministry of Education, such as certification and continuing education, but other things have been handled mainly by the provincial teachers' federations, such as professional conduct. And these powers were transferred to the Ontario College of Teachers. So all certified teachers in the province are by law now required to become members and to pay fees of the college, as well as joining one of the teaching unions or federations. And so this is a regulatory body, a self-regulatory body, and they deal with accreditation, and it's for both elementary and secondary schools. Now, two of the most significant policy actions that emerged from the college in its early years are the following. First was the development of and adoption of an official ethical standards of teaching for the profession and standards of practice for the teaching profession. The ethical standards essentially recodified existing regulations for professional ethics and conduct from the Education Act, the Teaching Professions Act, and a couple other policies. And it becomes the basis for judging allegations of professional misconduct under the college's discipline process. And so the ethical standards was a reformulation of what existed already, but standards of practice were entirely new and represented the first time in Ontario policy history that any attempt had been made to specify in operational terms a multidimensional vision of teachers' professional knowledge and practice. And it identified teacher competency standards in 5 broad domains: commitment to pupils and pupil learning, professional knowledge, teaching practice, leadership and community, and ongoing professional learning. And then within each domain, there was a set of standards and indicators associated with those standards that are specified. Under professional knowledge, for example, teachers must know their subject matter, the Ontario curriculum, and education-related legislation. They have to know a variety of effective teaching and assessment practices, and so on, effective classroom management strategies. So the OCT, the Ontario College of Teachers, have used the standards of practice as a basis for evaluating and accrediting initial teacher education programs, and so on. So they have this real look at the holistic perspective of what teachers do. What happens if you break the law? What happens if you're not professional? Well, they have something called the Blue Pages. You can look for that. The complaints and discipline decisions of the OCT tells you what kinds of complaints are made against teachers and what happens to them. The second major policy action undertaken by the OCT was to develop and implement the province's first accreditation process for the faculties of education. And these programs were initially accredited for a period of 3 years, and then the reaccreditation was for on a 7-year cycle. And then there's other areas of responsibility. You can browse through the website if you want to learn more. Now, the Larson article for this week discusses the teacher appraisal system that was introduced by the Ontario government in 2002. That act was part of the Harris Common Sense Revolution as part of an effort to reform education for more accountability, deregulation, privatization, competition, and choice in education, the education market. It sounds very similar in many ways to what was starting to happen with the current Conservative government. Hard to say what's going to happen after the current pandemic, but we'll see how things play out. These sort of neoliberal perspectives on accountability tends to emphasize sort of managerial values like standardization and quality assurance. Larson reviews teachers' experiences with the system and its intended and unintended questions. Now, what comes out of it is that it's really quite difficult to implement a strong appraisal system that relies on individual administrators to conduct the appraisals consistently. Ask the question, how should teachers be appraised? In 2006, the Liberal government eliminated that Ontario qualifying teachers test that was introduced in 2000. But in an effort to standardize the evaluation of recent graduates, they introduced a new program that was called the New Teacher Induction Program, which still exists today. It was designed to improve the skills and confidence of and reduce the level of attrition among teachers. And I have a link there so that you can browse through that if you are interested. One of the things you can ask about is, why are the voices of students and parents not heard in the process? And we can also ask the question, should experienced teachers also be appraised periodically, or should only new teachers be appraised in the first few years? Every so often, there are suggestions that teachers need to be tested on their math skills, for example. That was recently proposed. But there are some negative consequences to teacher testing. Testing a narrow range of prescribed knowledge potentially de-skills and deprofessionalizes and demoralizes teachers. So accountability, if it's too strict, can work against professional excellence. Such testing also begs the question of what is essential teacher knowledge, and tends to reproduce the status quo rather than open the doors for new ways about thinking how to teach and what to teach and so on. So I'll end here with this last thought. How do we ensure quality and accountability without stifling creativity and flexibility in education? And this ends the last video of on teachers and teaching.